She was just the cook, a fleeting shadow in a house that wasn't a home. But she didn't know the silent man who mended the fences owned the very ground they all stood on. He watched the wind comb through the long, honey-colored grass, a slow, deep breath drawn by the land itself. It was a language he understood better than the clipped, impatient tones of the people who now lived in the ranch house, people who saw the vastness as a commodity, a backdrop for their fleeting lives. They were tenants, temporary scars on a landscape that remembered the weight of bison and the soft tread of his ancestors' moccasins. He saw her then, a woman named Clara, her shoulders slumped under the weight of an apron and the invisible burden of servitude, her face pale against the brilliant, unforgiving sun. She moved in and out of the kitchen's swinging door, a ghost in her own life, tethered to the whims of the Caldwells. To them, she was the cook. To them, he was the hand, the Indian, a piece of the scenery as unremarkable as the fence posts he hammered into the earth. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, a secret he held close, a coiled serpent in his gut. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. Elias Blackwood moved with the land's rhythm, a slow and deliberate grace that the Caldwells mistook for lethargy. His hands, calloused and brown, knew the language of worn leather, the heft of a post-hole digger, the subtle shift in a horse's mood. He was mending a stretch of fence along the ridge, the wire singing a low, tense note as he stretched it taut. Below, the ranch house glittered, a monument to arrogance. Mr. Caldwell's voice, thin and sharp, carried on the breeze, complaining about the lack of modern conveniences, about the dust that dared to settle on his imported car. Elias worked on, his silence a shield. He didn't need to speak. The land spoke for him, to him. It whispered of patience, of endurance. The rocks were patient. The sky was patient. He could be patient, too. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in violent strokes of orange and purple, she approached him. Clara. She held a glass of water, condensation beating on its surface, a small, clear offering in the dusty expanse. "You must be thirsty," she said. Her voice was quiet, unlike the others. It didn't demand or command, it simply stated a fact. He stopped his work, his gaze fixed on her for a moment longer than was comfortable. He saw the weariness in her eyes, the faint lines of worry etched around her mouth. She was an outsider here, same as him, just in a different way. He took the glass, his fingers brushing hers. A jolt, small and unexpected, passed between them. "Thank you," he said. The words felt foreign, rough in his throat from disuse. He drank the water down in 3 long swallows, the cold liquid a shock to his system. He handed the empty glass back. He expected her to turn and leave, to scurry back to the safety of her kitchen, but she lingered. "He shouldn't speak to you that way," she said, her eyes darting toward the house. "Mr. Caldwell." Elias gave a short, non-committal grunt, turning back to the fence. "He pays my wage," he said, the statement a wall he erected between them. But she had seen something, a flicker of emotion in the stony mask. He felt her gaze on his back as she walked away, a new and unsettling variable in his long, calculated waiting game. Her small act of kindness was a stone tossed into a still, deep pond, and he would have to wait and see just how far the ripples would travel. A careless laugh from the Caldwell's teenage son, who was chasing butterflies through a patch of sacred datura, sent him spiraling back. The son was the same, a warm weight on his shoulders, but the hands he felt were different. They were his grandfather's, weathered and gentle, guiding his own small hand to the heart of the flower. He was a boy of 8, and the world was a tapestry of stories. "This one is for the dreamers, Tashunka," his grandfather had said using his childhood name, Little Horse. "It opens the door between worlds. You must respect it. Every plant, every creek, every hill had a name and a purpose, a place in the grand, breathing story of their people. This land was not a property line on a map. It was a living relative, a keeper of their memories." The flashback sharpened, the edges turning to glass. He was older now, 16, standing beside his father as a white sedan rolled up the gravel drive, kicking up a plume of dust that felt like a funeral shroud. He remembered the smell of his father's resignation, a sour mix of sweat and defeat. He remembered the crisp, soulless papers the men in suits held, the way their smiles never reached their eyes. They had talked of foreclosure, of market value, of opportunities elsewhere. They used words like knives, expertly dissecting his family's history, until all that was left was a number, an insufficient one. His grandfather had passed only a year before, and with him, it seemed, the strength to fight had gone. They had to sell. The word itself was a violence. Selling a part of your own body, a piece of your soul. He remembered watching the sedan drive away, leaving them standing in the dust of their own history, the silence that followed heavier than any sound. The memory was a ghost that walked beside him every day, a constant reminder of the promise he had yet to fulfill. The boy's laughter faded as he crushed another bloom under his expensive shoe, and the fire in Elias's gut burned a little hotter. Clara started to watch him. Her work in the kitchen was a repetitive, mindless rhythm of chopping and stirring, which left her mind free to wander, to observe. She saw him from her window, a solitary figure moving against the vast canvas of the plains. He never rushed. His economy of movement was a thing of beauty, a stark contrast to the frantic, wasteful energy of the Caldwells. They conquered the space with noise and clutter. He simply inhabited it, as if he had grown from the soil itself. She saw the way he would pause and lift his face to the sky, not to check the weather, but to listen. What did he hear? She only heard the incessant wind, the shrill cry of a hawk. He seemed to hear a symphony. One afternoon, emboldened by a strange curiosity, she brought him a plate of leftover stew, thick with root vegetables and tender beef. "It'll just go to waste," she said, a convenient excuse. He was cleaning a saddle, his hands moving with practiced care over the worn leather. He took the plate without a word, his eyes meeting hers. They were dark, deep-set, and held a history she couldn't begin to decipher. "It's a lonely place," she ventured, wrapping her arms around herself as a gust of wind whipped a strand of hair across her face. He finished a bite of stew before answering. "It's only lonely if you don't know how to listen." The words hung in the air between them, simple but profound. It wasn't a rebuke, but an invitation to a different way of seeing. Later that evening, she overheard Mrs. Caldwell on the phone, her voice dripping with condescension. "Oh, the help is fine. We have this local woman cooking, and some stoic Indian man who looks after the grounds. A real relic. He barely speaks. It's all very authentic." The word relic snagged in Clara's mind. She looked out the window at Elias, who was walking the perimeter of the horse corral, his silhouette stark against the fading light. He wasn't a relic. He was the most present person she had ever met. She felt a knot of shame tighten in her stomach, for her employer, for her own ignorance. She was beginning to understand that there were two worlds operating on this ranch, the loud, shallow world of the Caldwells and the deep, silent world of the man they called the Hand. The sky had been a bruised purple all afternoon, the air thick and heavy with unspoken threats. When the storm finally broke, it was with a primal fury. A spear of lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder so violent the windows of the ranch house rattled in their frames. Then, the lights went out. The house was plunged into a shocking, absolute darkness, punctuated only by the panicked shrieks of Mrs. Caldwell and the angry cursing of her husband. They fumbled for phones, for flashlights, their modern world stripped away, leaving them helpless and afraid. Clara, however, felt a strange sense of release. She slipped out the back door, drawn by the raw power of the storm. The rain came in horizontal sheets, plastering her thin shirt to her skin, but it felt cleansing. And then she saw him. Elias was standing by the corral fence, a silhouette against the flashes of lightning. He was perfectly still, his face turned up to the storm. He wasn't fighting it or hiding from it. He was a part of it. She walked slowly towards him, the wet ground sucking at her shoes. She didn't know what she was going to say, but she felt an undeniable pull to be near his calm in the center of the chaos. He must have heard her approach over the roar of the wind, because he turned his head slightly. He didn't seem surprised to see her. They stood in silence for a long time, two solitary figures watching the heavens tear themselves apart. It was a language older than words, a shared awe. When the storm began to recede, moving east across the plains, it left behind a world washed clean, and a sky full of stars so bright they looked like scattered diamonds on black velvet. "There," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. He pointed a long finger toward the northern sky. That's Changkepi Wakang, the sacred road, the Milky Way. My grandfather said it's the path the spirits take to the world beyond. He spoke the Lakota words as if they were stones, smooth and heavy with meaning. He had offered her a piece of his world, a glimpse behind the silent mask. The space between them was no longer empty, but filled with a quiet, burgeoning respect. The smell of the rain-soaked sage, pungent and clean, unlocked another door in his mind. He was no longer standing by the corral with Clara. He was in a small, sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. His father lay in the bed, a shadow of the strong man he once was, his body withered by sickness and a grief that had eaten him from the inside out. The loss of the land had been a wound that never healed, a constant, dull ache in the heart of their family. His father's hand, frail and papery, found his. "Elias," he had whispered, his breath shallow. "A promise. You must promise me." Elias had leaned closer, his own heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. "Anything, father." His father's eyes, though clouded with pain, held a flicker of the old fire. "Get it back. Get our land back." He paused, a rattling cough shaking his small frame. "Not with a gun. That is their way. That is the way we lose. You use their rules, their paper, their greed. You learn their language of money and lies. You be patient. Be a stone in the river. Let them flow around you, and when the time is right, you will be the dam." The words were a final, desperate testament, a transfer of a lifelong burden onto his son's shoulders. "Our spirit is in that soil," his father had gasped, his grip tightening for a moment. "My father is there. His father is there. Don't let them die." Elias had made the promise. It became the singular focus of his existence. It shaped the next 20 years of his life. Long hours at manual labor jobs, saving every penny. Nights spent in community college libraries, poring over books on finance, real estate law, corporate structuring. The slow, painstaking process of creating an anonymous LLC, a faceless entity that could move through the world of commerce undetected. He had sacrificed relationships, friendships, the chance at a normal life, all for this one, all-consuming goal. He had become the stone his father spoke of, hard and unmoving, his emotions worn smooth by the constant current of his singular purpose. Standing there, with the scent of his homeland filling his lungs, he knew the time to become the dam was drawing near. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, under a sky of brilliant, indifferent blue. Mr. Caldwell, puffed up with the self-importance of a man who has never been told no, strode out onto the lawn where Elias was trimming the hedges. He was holding a rolled-up blueprint which he unfurled with a dramatic flourish. "Blackwood," he boomed, not waiting for a response. "I've had a brilliant idea. We're putting in a pool, right over there." He pointed with a manicured finger toward a small, gentle slope by the creek, a spot shaded by a cluster of ancient, gnarled cottonwood trees. A cold dread, sharp and swift, pierced through Elias's carefully constructed composure. He knew that grove. It was not just a collection of trees. It was a place of whispers, a sanctuary, a place where his great-grandfather was buried, his grave marked not by a stone, but by the living roots of the oldest cottonwood. It was a place his grandfather had taken him as a boy, a place to be silent, to listen, to honor. Wakan. Sacred. "No," Elias said. The word was not loud, but it was absolute. It dropped into the air with the weight of a granite boulder. Mr. Caldwell blinked, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. "No, I beg your pardon," he scoffed. "I don't think you're in a position to say no. I'm talking about a state-of-the-art infinity-edge pool. It's going to be magnificent." The mask of the quiet, compliant hand shattered. The years of forced humility, of biting his tongue until it bled, fell away. "You cannot build there," Elias stated, his voice low and dangerous. He took a step forward. "That is sacred ground." Mr. Caldwell's face hardened, his condescension curdling into anger. "Don't you start with that mystical mumbo-jumbo. This is my property leased and paid for. I'll build a damn swimming pool wherever I please. Now get back to your work before you find yourself without a job." From the kitchen window, Clara watched the exchange, her hand frozen on a carrot she was peeling. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the transformation in Elias. He was no longer the quiet cowboy. He was a guardian, fierce and unmovable, and she saw for the very first time the raw, unmasked agony in his eyes. Elias did not go back to the hedges. He turned and walked away, his movement stiff with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. He walked past the corrals, past the barn, his feet carrying him to the one place he needed to be. He spent the rest of the day and the entire night in the grove of cottonwoods. He didn't build a fire. He didn't eat. He simply sat with his back against the trunk of the oldest tree, its rough bark a familiar comfort against his spine. The sun set, the moon rose, and the stars wheeled across the sky, but he did not move. He was a sentinel, a silent statue of grief and fury. His mind was a tempest, the memories of his father's promise and his grandfather's stories crashing against the present-day sacrilege proposed by Caldwell. He was no longer just a man. He was the living embodiment of his lineage, the last line of defense for the spirits who rested in this soil. Meanwhile, back at the house, a deep unease had settled over Clara. The confrontation had shaken her. The look in Elias's eyes haunted her. This was more than a disagreement over landscaping. Acting on a pure, unexplainable gut feeling, she waited until the Caldwells were asleep and went into the small, dusty office Mr. Caldwell used. She turned on his computer, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed the address of the ranch into the county's online property database. The search results were immediate. Owner, 724 Prairie Wind LLC. It was cold, anonymous, corporate. It felt wrong. Something made her search for the LLC itself. The filings were public record. Registered agent, E. Blackwood. The name hit her like a physical blow. Elias. It couldn't be. The next morning, she found him walking back from the grove, his face a mask of exhaustion and grim resolve. "That place by the creek," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's important, isn't it? To your family." He stopped, his dark eyes boring into her, searching. For the first time, he didn't see a part of the Caldwell's world. He saw an ally. He didn't confess, but he told her a story his grandfather had told him, about how the cottonwood tree sends its roots deep to find water, how it holds the earth together so the creek can run clear. It was a story about resilience, about legacy, about holding on. And she finally understood. The sound of the engine was a violation, a low, guttural growl that tore through the morning's peace. A yellow bulldozer, monstrous and obscene, crawled its way up the drive, followed by a pickup truck carrying a team of surveyors. Mr. Caldwell stood on the porch, a triumphant smirk on his face, a mug of coffee in his hand. He was a king surveying his conquest. He saw Elias emerge from the barn, and his smirk widened. He expected a final, pathetic protest, another plea based on superstition. What he got was something else entirely. Elias walked to the edge of the lawn, positioning himself directly in the bulldozer's path. He wasn't stooped. He wasn't the hired hand. He stood with the quiet, unshakable authority of a mountain. His face was calm, but his eyes held the cold fire of a winter dawn. The foreman of the survey crew, a man with a sunburned neck, yelled for him to move. Elias didn't flinch. From the kitchen window, Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The precipice. "Mr. Caldwell strode forward, his face red with impatience. "Blackwood, I swear to God, if you don't get out of the way right now, I will have you arrested for trespassing." The irony of the word was so thick, it was almost comical. Elias slowly reached into the inner pocket of his worn canvas jacket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a folded sheaf of legal documents. He unfolded them with deliberate care. "This," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying easily in the still air, "is a formal notice of lease termination." Caldwell stared, dumbfounded. "What? What are you talking about?" Elias's gaze was unflinching. "You are in breach of contract. Specifically Section 7, subsection C. The lessee shall not alter, deface, or destroy any area of the property deemed to have cultural, historical, or spiritual significance without express written consent from the lessor." Lee Caldwell sputtered, a choked, furious sound. "The lesser? I'll call the damn lesser right now. Who do you think you are?" And then came the moment that shattered their world, the climax of a 20-year promise. Elias looked past Caldwell, at the ancient trees, at the land that held his blood and his history. "I am the man whose great-grandfather is buried under that tree you want to tear down," he said, his voice resonating with the weight of generations. "My name is Elias Blackwood. I am the sole proprietor of 724 Prairie Wind, LLC. He locked his eyes on Caldwell's. "This is my land, and you have 30 days to leave." The silence that followed was more profound than any noise the bulldozer could have made. It was a vacuum, sucking the air, the arrogance, and the power right out of Mr. Caldwell. His face, which had been a mask of smug authority, crumbled through stages of confusion, disbelief, and finally, a sputtering, impotent rage. The surveyors and the bulldozer operator stood frozen, suddenly aware they were bit players in a drama far heavier than a simple construction job. The truth of Elias's words settled over the scene, rearranging the entire universe of the ranch. The Caldwells, who saw themselves as masters of this domain, were nothing more than tenants, and the quiet Indian, the relic, the hired hand, was their landlord. He was the king. The days that followed were a flurry of panicked phone calls to lawyers, of slammed doors and shouted accusations. But the paperwork was ironclad. The contracts were precise. Elias had used their own system, their own language of law and commerce, to perfection. The Caldwells' departure was a graceless affair, a whirlwind of expensive luggage and bitter recriminations, their luxury sedan kicking up a final angry cloud of dust as it disappeared down the long drive. And then there was peace. The land sighed in relief. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, no longer threatened. The dust settled. Elias stood on the spot where the bulldozer had been halted, his gaze fixed on the sacred grove. The victory was his. The promise was fulfilled. But it felt less like a triumph and more like the end of a long, grueling war. It left him feeling hollowed out, the single-minded purpose that had driven him for 2 decades now gone, leaving a vast, quiet emptiness in its place. He was just a man standing on his own land, alone. Clara approached him softly, her footsteps barely making a sound on the earth. "I guess I should pack my things, too," she said, her voice uncertain. She was just the cook after all, part of the world that had just been evicted. Elias turned to look at her, really look at her. He saw not an employee but a witness, a person who had chosen to see. "The land needs a caretaker," he said. The words were not an order, not a job offer, but an invitation. "The house needs a heartbeat." He gestured toward the horizon where the hills rolled in gentle, ancient waves. "Those hills have names," he said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips for the first time. "Real names. Would you like to learn them?" Clara looked from his weary, hopeful face to the endless land, and for the first time, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. She nodded. "Yes."